Hello, everyone. I'm Dan Lewin, CEO of the Computer History Museum, and I'd like to welcome you to today's program, The Startup Community Way, featuring early stage investor and entrepreneur Brad Feld, in conversation with NCWIT co-founder and CEO Lucy Sanders. It's a particular pleasure for me to introduce the program today. I've had a wonderful 20-year personal friendship and relationship with Brad, and was involved early on in getting my former employer, Microsoft, to engage with NCWIT. I've had deep respect for both of them, all the work they've done over the years, and the lessons I've learned from engaging with them personally and in their professional endeavors. Today's program is in support of CHM's new mission to decode technology for everyone, its computing past, digital present, and its future impact on humanity. As new technology finds its way into our lives through innovation and entrepreneurship, in today's program, Brad is going to help us understand the process and the ways in which we can become better informed as digital citizens. Our programs are made possible through the generosity of our members and donors, and we need everyone to opt in to this conversation and help us. It's important, it's timely, and we're embarking upon this new journey and new mission, and it's just the beginning. If you're not a member, please visit our website and consider joining and giving, and there is a join and give section. Today's program will be kicked off by CHM's VP of Innovation, Marguerite Gong Hancock. So Marguerite, over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Daniel. I'm excited about today's program. So timely and important for all of us. With the COVID crisis during the past 15 weeks, more than 48 million Americans have applied for unemployment benefits. And even before COVID, income and wealth divide was accelerated in many countries. So what's the path forward? New companies are surely going to be key for enabling prosperity, recovery, as well as upward mobility. But entrepreneurs can't do it alone. And so the communities that support them, the startup communities, are key. We're just thrilled to have Brad Feld here with us today to decode entrepreneurship and innovation in startup communities, which is really at the heart of CHM's work and one of our core initiatives focused on innovation. Today we'll explore what can we learn from Brad's own journey as an investor and entrepreneur, what makes startup communities thrive, a topic which he's elucidated in his latest book, The Startup Community Way, Evolving an Entrepreneurial Ecosystem, and what are lessons from across the United States and beyond, and what traps should we avoid, and what are implications for current issues, such as diversity, ethical leadership, and more. So we're thrilled that Brad is here to share his experience and insights with Lucy Sanders, and as is tradition, I'll introduce our speakers with 5 numbers. First, Brad Feld, investor, entrepreneur, founder of Techstars and The Foundry, and book author. 19, the age he started his first company, 7 books written, 30 years he's been involved with Amy Batchelor, 25 marathons run, and 3, his magic number. Welcome, Brad. And now Lucy. Lucy Sanders is a distinguished computer scientist who's worked in R&D and executive positions in industry, and now is CEO and co-founder of National Center for Women in Information Technology, NCWIT. She and her 5 numbers include 6 patents, 24 years worked at AT&T Labs, 1,400 organizational members of NCWIT, 16,000 girls and women in the NCWIT aspirations in the computing community, and 22 different fruits and vegetables in her garden. Lucy, thank you so much for joining us today. Brad and Lucy, over to you. We can't wait to hear your conversation. Thank you for being a part of CHM Live today.
Thank you, Marguerite. Really happy to join you all. Yes, that's 22 different fruits and vegetables, and probably 1,022 different kinds of weeds, I think, somewhere in there. I'm very excited to be here and really looking forward to participating in a Computer History Museum segment like this. The Computer History Museum is one of my favorite places, and I'll just support Daniel's messaging around how great it is to be a member, how wonderful it is to go and look at all the history of the computing discipline. So thank you for hosting this. I've had many conversations with Brad over the last 15 or 16 years, and they've all been just wonderful. I've learned a lot. This one will be no different, and I'm sure we will cover a broad range of topics and have a little fun in doing so. So I want to remind everybody who's listening that if you have a question, please use the Q&A feature, and we will be getting to answering some of those questions in the last 15 minutes. So with that, I think we'll just get right to it. Brad, hi, how are you?
Doing good, Lucy. Great to see you.
Great to see you too. I wanted to spend the first part of our time together talking about your journey, your personal journey, because I know there's some interesting stops along the way here and there. And it's always interesting to hear about somebody's first job. So why don't you tell us what you did the first time you earned some money?
Well, my first job was very short-lived. So I like to talk about my first and second jobs because my second job was a little bit longer lived, but I got fired from both of them. I grew up in Dallas, Texas. I was a serious tennis player as a junior. I played from about age 10 to age 14 before I completely burnt out of tennis. And I think the thing away from tennis at age 14 was I discovered computers and girls at about the same time. And that was the end of my tennis career. But during that period of time, in the summertime in Texas, the best job at my tennis club was to work, if you're a teenager, was to work in the grill. And why somebody would want to work in a grill in Texas, in Dallas, in the middle of summer, where it was already 100 degrees outside, and then whatever the heat, as you're making burgers and fries and stuff, it's unclear to me. But I was deemed by the powers that be at my tennis club that I wasn't mature enough to work in the grill. So I ended up getting a maintenance job. And what the maintenance job was cleaning out, the locker rooms, throwing away the trash, doing, random cleanup on all the tennis courts. But the part that was really distasteful to me was dealing with all of the bugs, and especially the hornets and the wasps' nests that were everywhere at this particular tennis club. And I just kind of refused to do it, which was the thing that got me fired from that job. A year or two later, a group of us from my high school ended up all getting a job at a fast food restaurant at our shopping mall. So we had a big shopping mall that's no longer there, but it was called Prestonwood Town Mall or Prestonwood Shopping Mall or something like that. And it was one of these huge shopping malls in Texas, as big, sort of indoor malls were being created. And they had a food court, and they probably had 50 restaurants, and each restaurant had its own group, right? So the smart kids and the nerds were all in one restaurant, and the jocks were all in another restaurant, and the stoners were all in another restaurant, where they were the workers. And the group of smart kids that I was part of ended up working at a restaurant called Potatoes, Etc. And what we did was we baked potatoes, and then we had 18 different toppings that we put on potatoes. And it's sort of a classic fast food job. But because we were nerds, we were always trying to optimize the way that we got from potato to whatever. And it was a pretty busy place. But I had I didn't like the job very much. And I had a boss who was just mean and cruel. And one day I said something very inappropriate, and she fired me. And so for my first two jobs, I really learned that my own oppositional behavior to having a boss was probably going to be an inhibitor. And the last job that I would add in this sort of beginning arc is the next job that I did, which was I decided to tutor for the math SAT. And so I'm a junior in high school, and I ended up tutoring. And instead of getting paid $3 an hour, like all my friends were getting paid, I charged $30 an hour. And I could only do 4 sessions a week. And I had so much demand for my tutoring that near the end of it, I was very restrictive on who I would tutor. And I decided as a junior in high school that the only people that I would consider as clients would be seniors who were girls. And so my job, I sort of learned the dynamics of supply and demand. But the other side of it that was really powerful was all of a sudden I was really making my own business at a very early age, and had a lot of control over my time, had a lot of control over what I was actually doing and how I was doing it, and was able to charge, a premium for my time relative to all of my peers, because of what I was doing and how I was doing it.
That's so interesting. I was talking with Amy back and forth a little bit about this conversation, and she said, I think Brad was disobedient in his first job. So I can't decide if he was fired or he was disobedient, but I just thought that was a great word, disobedient. It does sort of play into being an entrepreneur sometimes, right? Being just a tad bit disobedient. So you were hanging out with lots of intelligent and sort of technical people. Since this is the Computer History Museum, let's ask the obvious question. What was your first computer and what did you do with it?
So my first computer was an Apple II. And it was an Apple II that didn't have anything as a suffix after the two. So I got it when I was 13 for my bar mitzvah. I turned 13 in December of 1978. So I must have bought it at the end of 1978 or the very beginning of 1979. I was 13, Krugrands were a big deal. And it was well before people started thinking about what Krugrands actually represented. But the sort of classic thing that you did after you got bar mitzvah, you get a bunch of little checks, you'd add up all your checks, and then all of my friends at the time that were getting bar mitzvah would buy some Krugrands. Sometimes I'd buy 1 or 2 or 3, depending on how much money you got. I had no interest in that. I wanted a computer. So with my dad, we went, I think I got about $1,600 for my bar mitzvah is a number that sticks in my head. And we went and we bought a Apple II. I convinced him that we'd be able to get what I needed for just $1,600. Of course, by the time it was all said and done, it was about $3,000. So he was willing to front me an additional $1,400. And it was a very early Apple II. It was kind of Apple II. The disk drives had just come out, but most everything was still on a cassette tape. The hardware that extended the Apple II to make it an Apple, sort of more memory and integer card to give it different kinds of math was just starting to come out. So I got involved at the very beginning of it. And I had immediate love for the time that I could spend lost with the computer. Just hours and hours and hours. I remember so vividly the Apple Red Book and typing in the code from every single program in there, saving it initially to the cassette and then eventually saving it to the disk drive and then modifying the programs and playing and sort of learning endlessly, hours after hours after hours. And then of course, as software started to come out, with some more meaning, sort of playing with the software and then trying to write things that did certain things like the different games that we were playing and extending the graphics and that sort of stuff. So I got a lot of use out of that computer, really through junior high and high school. Not just in terms of my own sort of learning, but this understanding of how to play around with things starting from scratch. And do something that was very much in my mind rather than something physical and tangible. And that was pretty defining for me in terms of how the rest of my life and all the work I've done has worked from there.
I bet if we had a poll of people who are listening, a lot of people's first machines were either from Radio Shack or from Apple. A lot of those early machines. Do you remember who you got your first email from? Like when do you recall using email in any real sense?
Sure. So I went to MIT as an undergrad, and in 1984, MIT rolled out a thing called Project Athena, which was a cross-campus network that everybody had access to. And it was MIT already had this thing called SIPB and had, you know, a bunch of sort of time sharing computing resources that you could get an account and a password, but it's sort of very isolated, the usage. And with Project Athena, all of a sudden, you essentially got an internet email address, even if you didn't really realize you did. And that was the first time that I really used email. Was kind of in 1984, 1985 as an undergraduate. I had done some BBS stuff before that when I had the Apple II in high school, but I didn't really consider that to be email because that was kind of messaging within that closed community of whatever the BBS was, versus this idea that all of a sudden you could be in front of the computer and you could send a note to literally anybody who was connected to the network, which because MIT was one of the major nodes, you know, on the internet at that point, pre-commercial internet, you actually could connect with, you know, friends at other schools that in whatever cases it ended up with email addresses. So that was it. In a practical business sense, from the time that I started my first company, which was in 1987, we always used email very extensively. One of my co-founder had worked at DEC, Digital Equipment Corp. And of course, DEC ran on email. And so from the very beginning, we were using email, but it was internal to our company because the technology just sucked for being able to connect to other companies. I remember setting up, you know, Novell servers, Novell mail servers, and trying to connect our clients via email. And the whole thing was just miserable. But very early on, I ended up on CompuServe. And so when CompuServe and the internet connected to the internet, I spent a lot of money sending emails via CompuServe to the internet because you paid by email for the CompuServe bridge at the very beginning. And, you know, when I say a lot of money, maybe $20 or $30 a month, which to me back then was a lot of money, but it was really sort of wired in as a young person into my workflow around that.
It's so interesting. So let's fast forward. You came to Boulder in 1995. And I think that's right, around then.
Yep.
And what did you think about it when you first rolled into town, and why Boulder?
So I'll answer the why first. Amy and I met in Boston and were friends for many years before we got together as a couple. And when I sold my first company in 1993, when I was 28, Amy's from Alaska, I'm from Dallas, and Boston, while it was very good to us, was not home. It never felt like home. And when I sold my first company, I said to Amy, by the time I'm 30, we'll be out of Boston. We'll move somewhere else. And we had said this publicly, and most of our friends just kind of laughed at us and, you're just whining about Boston, whatever. And about 2 months before I turned 30, Amy told me, I'm moving to Boulder, and if you'd like to come with me, please do. And we'd been married for a couple of years, so she had a pretty strong hand that she played there. And we'd both been to Colorado, and we liked Colorado, plenty of things about it that we enjoyed. And she'd spent some time here as a kid for a year when her family lived here. And as a kid, I came here skiing a lot, not to Boulder, but to Colorado. So we had this sense of Colorado could be fun. I was doing business all across the country by this point because of the company that I bought mine. I was flying around constantly. I'd started making angel investments, and I was investing on the East Coast and the West Coast with the money that I made from selling that first company. And so I kind of figured, I'll just be in the middle of the country. We'd been to Boulder. We thought it was a beautiful place. I kind of remembered it from Mork and Mindy, and that's kind of what I knew about it. But I love the mountains. And we just came, and I knew one person. He moved away about 6 months later. So we didn't move to Boulder for business or for friends. We just decided to go look for a place to live that we could build a life around. And it's one of our deeply held beliefs, and one of mine, especially around entrepreneurship, is so many people go to where they think they should be because of an opportunity. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. But from an entrepreneurial perspective, especially if you're embracing it entirely around your life, I like to say, go find the place you want to live and build your life around that. Now, we didn't know if Boulder was going to be that. It was a hypothesis. We're like, if we don't like Boulder, we'll move away somewhere else. And within 6 months of being in Boulder, even though we didn't know very many people, we were starting to meet some folks. we had decided this was home for the duration. This was the place we wanted to be. And today, part of my understanding of that, amongst other things, is I'm not a city person. I don't like big cities. And I have never really liked big cities. And while I've spent a lot of time in New York and Boston and the Bay Area and Seattle and Los Angeles and keep going down the list, I'm fine for a couple of days and then I just want to get out of there. I need the space. I need the sort of notion that I'm living amongst lots of expansiveness and that I've got a lot of ability to just wander around outside and feel that space. And that's part of what I thrive in. And so we've been here now 25 years and I expect we'll be here till the end.
I remember when you, probably 5 years after, around 2000, I started hearing your name, and very active as an investor, and people were talking about entrepreneurship more than I had ever heard before. And probably over those next 20 some odd years, things were starting to happen in Boulder. Things, in terms of you launching Foundry Group, Techstars, a number of different things happening in Boulder, writing some of your books. And you developed something in startup communities, one of your books called the Boulder Thesis, which I thought was really interesting as a way to describe how Boulder is going through this, in some sense, journey towards being more entrepreneurial. So why don't you tell listeners a bit about the Boulder Thesis, generally, what is it, how you really came up with that from your time here in Boulder?
So in 2012, I wrote a book called Startup Communities. At the time, the phrase startup communities didn't exist. So it's a great joy of an author to actually write something and sort of coin a phrase. So that's one of the things that I carry around inside me that gives me some gratification. In 2010, coming out of the financial crisis, an article was written that said that entrepreneurship was going to be the path forward for our society and our economies globally coming out of the financial crisis. And I believe that very deeply, sort of independent of the financial crisis. And I viewed the financial crisis as the moment where our society shifted from a priority on hierarchical organizations and hierarchical thinking to one that was network-based and network-driven. And there were always hierarchies before, and there were lots of networks driven phenomena. But this was the tipping point where the order of operations shifted. Hierarchies used to be more important than networks. Now networks were more important than hierarchies. And this article said that they were already seeing evidence of this in cities like, and of course some of these places aren't cities, cities like the Bay Area, which lots of cities, New York, Boston, and Boulder. And when I read that article, I thought to myself, one of these things is not like the other, right? Boulder's 100,000 people. The entirety of Boulder, all of the Boulder's population could probably fit in a couple of buildings on one block in Manhattan. It'd be a little tight, right? But we could do it. And yet, like the two things were both having the same kind of dynamic. So that started me down the path of really trying to figure out what was going on and what had been going on in Boulder that created this enormous entrepreneurial enthusiasm that was generating this phenomena that I subsequently labeled a startup community. I came up with 4 things. And the neat thing about Boulder being 100,000 people was it was big enough to be interesting, right? It wasn't a 5,000 person city, but it was small enough that I kind of get my mind around it. I didn't know every single thing that was going on, and I wasn't involved in every single thing that was going on, but I could get a good framing of it. So it was a good laboratory to try to understand this. The Boulder Thesis has 4 principles, and in hindsight, they seem pretty straightforward. That's nice because they're very durable. At the time, they were pretty provocative because it was not the traditional way that people thought about innovation, whatever. And you'd hear phrases like innovation hub, innovation economy, research hub. Occasionally, you'd hear the phrase entrepreneurial ecosystem, but nobody really knew what that meant. It was very mushy feeling. And a lot of the energy was tied back to the Bay Area. People would say, if you want to start a tech company, you have to be in the Bay Area. And my response was, that's nonsense. Like, no, you should be able to start a company anywhere you want in the world. And by the way, I started to believe that any city that had any mass, 100,000 people or more, needed this thing that I started calling a startup community long-term to be part of its innovation economy. And that this democratization of innovation was going to spread throughout the world very rapidly. So I came up with these 4 principles, and I'll just riff them off quickly. The first is that the leaders have to be entrepreneurs. Lots of other people participate in the startup community, but if you don't have a critical mass of entrepreneurs playing leadership roles, your startup community won't go anywhere. The second is that you have to have a very long-term view. And I used to say you have to have a 20-year view. Now I say you have to have a 20-year view from today. So you have to be continuously looking out 20 years into the future and being willing to play a very long game. The third is you have to be inclusive of anyone who wants to engage at any level. And I probably got some of the word and some of the thoughts around inclusivity from working with you, Lucy, and all the work that I was doing with you at NCWIT and all the learning I was doing about both gender inequity and gender equity and how to drive those dynamics, especially in the context of tech and innovation. But I meant it very broadly, right? Not just identity inclusion, but sort of on all dimensions of this idea of just open arms welcoming anyone who wants to engage in your startup community. Because I'd seen in so many places, including in the Bay Area, lots of factions, and I had this for sure in Boston. When I lived in Boston, you know, I was in a box. I was a MIT entrepreneur. And I was categorized, and those were good categories, like good labels on my category. I didn't, you know, like I can't complain about those, but there were lots of factions versus like, hey, anybody wants to play, come out and play. And then the fourth was that you have to have activities and events to engage in the act of entrepreneurship on a continual basis. I'd already won Entrepreneur of the Year awards. I got a I got a Lifetime Achievement Award at age 40. And I thought, you know, when I got it, I was initially offended. I'm like, this is the peak? Like, this is my lifetime achievement? And then, of course, I said, well, let's rename it the Half-Life Achievement Award because I'm only 40. And then I'm like, oh, I know physics enough to know that that's probably not very good either, because that just means that for the rest of my life, my impact is decaying. But, you know, like this notion of those kinds of things, they're nice and they're flattering, but they're not that meaningful in terms of driving the growth and development of the startup community. So I use those four principles as a framework for how to create a startup community anywhere in the world. And, you know, 8 years later in 2020, I think it's pretty well understood that that's the driver of how to do it. And we're seeing, of course, the democratization of innovation. We're seeing startup communities globally. Sure, the Bay Area is still a very important and powerful and wonderful place in terms of entrepreneurship, but I don't think people say anymore, if you want to start a company, you need to be in the Bay Area. I think there's a lot of comfort that you can build companies anywhere in the world.
Absolutely. And you mentioned startup communities and being gratified that you can write a book, you know, and get thoughts out there. Say a bit more about why you decided to become an author. How did you know, you're also a very early blogger. You know, and you write a lot, and you write a lot of very interesting things. So what caused you to go down that road?
A couple of things. One is my mom's an artist. And so I grew up with one parent my dad was a doctor, and my mom was an artist. So, and my dad has his own medical practice. So I saw my dad as an entrepreneur, and I saw my mom as a creative artist, and they were equal partners in their relationship. So it was fascinating and powerful as a kid to grow up in that environment and sort of have those two influences on me. I love to read. I'm a voracious reader. Both Amy and I one of our favorite things to do is lay on our respective couches in the living room with our dogs and read a book. And, you know, we both read a lot, and I learn by reading versus by listening. I for sure learn by listening too, but I really learn when I'm able to sit and read quietly. And it's, by the way, reflective of that early experience with the computer, where I was learning by sitting in front of the computer and doing stuff, right? The same kind of exercise in my brain. And I've always loved to write. I've always written a lot of stuff. I would say most of it was business related, and can joke about just sort of the number of words of email over one's lifetime that's been written, or proposals or whatever. But in 2004, I was one of a couple of people. Fred Wilson was another, Jerry Colonna was another, Dave Hornick was another, who were very early VC bloggers. And I think even at this point, Jerry was sort of not a VC anymore, but he, that was sort of the thing he was known for, even at the moment that he started blogging some. And there was something, the reason I was motivated to do it was twofold. One was I was fascinated with the RSS protocol and user-generated content, and the view that there'd be this sort of next wave of content generation, which wouldn't be controlled by publishers or agents. There wouldn't be an agency dynamic between the person writing and everybody reading. The other was I knew instinctively that the way I figured things out was to write them down. And I didn't really have the muscle of writing things down in public. And I was curious about that. I wanted to see what that felt like. And I knew, and also from talking to Fred, that it was a durable thing. Like, you had to do it for a while to feel comfortable with it. And of course, when I wrote my very first blog post, probably 3 people looked at it, right? So it's irrelevant that anybody's looking at it, but you're still like getting used to it. And then 10 people are looking at it regularly, and then 100, and then 1,000. And there's some point at which you no longer are self-conscious about what you're writing. You're just writing for yourself to try to figure something out, but you're willing to put it out in the world to get feedback, to help others understand what you're thinking about, attract others into your network around your thoughts. And I really found that I learned a lot from that experience. So in some ways it was very selfish, because it allowed me to exercise and think about different things and put energy into them on a continual basis. At some point, one of the things I became interested in doing was demystifying venture capital, because in this time frame, 2005, 2006, 2007, venture capital was still pretty much in the dumps post the collapse of the internet bubble, but people were starting to be interested in it again. And the opacity around venture capital, the lack of understanding by entrepreneurs of how a term sheet worked and how to negotiate a deal and how VC firms worked, continued to startle me as I ran into it over and over again. And the information advantage that VCs had over entrepreneurs felt kind of shitty to me, having been previously an entrepreneur. And, VCs do this all day long, every day, and entrepreneurs rarely do it. And they're dependent on a gatekeeper, in a lot of cases, their lawyer, to help them understand this. So with one of my, at the time, we were at a firm that was a spinoff from SoftBank called Mobius Venture Capital with Jason Mendelson, who was one of my partners at the time. We wrote a series of about 30 blog posts demystifying a term sheet. And they were incredibly popular, and the feedback from it was wild. And I learned a lot, actually, from the feedback from it. And about 2 or 3 years later, people started sending us PDFs of the thing as course material for college courses that they were teaching on entrepreneurship. So this is about 2008, 2009. And, we'd add a blog post here and a blog post there. And I remember when somebody sent me a PDF and said, it would be so helpful if you would just turn this into a book. Because, I would use it as my book. And I checked with a few other people, and the answer was yes. So we ended up writing a book called Venture Deals, and the subtitle is Be Smarter Than Your Lawyer and VC, which continues to be an extremely popular book. We're in the 4th edition of it, so we've updated it multiple times. And it turns out the term sheet series, which we, of course, completely rewrote so it fit within the context of the book, was only about 10% of the book. Because once we started to get into it, we're like, wow, there's so many other things to talk about. How VC funds work, how to negotiate, how to think about fundraising, how to deal with legal things you shouldn't do. And, it just sort of expanded from there. So I give that as an arc, right? I mean, if you use that as the beginning of the arc, by 2010, 2011, I decided, you know what, I really love this process of writing a book, and I'm going to tie it back to programming. I stopped writing code professionally in 1992. I was running my company. I didn't have time to write software anymore. I had been writing very little software because we had a whole bunch of people that did that. And I missed it. And every couple of years I'd learn a language and I'd learn a new tool chain and I'd play around with something and I'd write hello world 9 different ways. But it's just the amount of energy that you'd have to put into the new sort of stuff to get to a point where you could do anything. By the time I got to the point that I could do anything, I didn't have any time to focus on it anymore. I'd used up the time that I was going to spend on it. And professionally, I was consumed with everything I had. It turns out that for me, writing a book is very similar to developing a piece of software. Fundamentally, lots of different activities, but the energy and the emotional effort for it was analogous for me. Thinking through a problem, understanding how to solve the problem, trying lots of stuff, rewriting things, throwing some of your book or code away, refactoring some stuff that doesn't work, changing the way the user interface works, rearranging the pieces. But there are 2 big advantages to writing books or long form content like that. One was the tools never changed. And yeah, granted, I probably spend more time now in Google Docs than I do in Microsoft Word, but I still spend time in the same tools that I've used from the beginning. The word processing experience doesn't change materially. More importantly, the language syntax doesn't change. And like, being a developer, if you're developing in a certain language over a long period of time and you stay with that language, you become really good at that language, right? If you're a Python developer and you just keep writing Python, and of course Python extends in, libraries and technology changes, but you just get better. You understand how to do certain things in code. The same is true if you write a lot, is that you just get better and better at writing. And you how to ideas better and how to be efficient in a way that engages the reader without having to learn a bunch of new syntax and learn a bunch of new libraries and stuff like that. So there is an analogy there for me that's allowed me as I get older, whenever I think about, at this year I'm going to learn, I'm going to go back and I'm going to learn Go and I'm going to start doing some stuff in Go. And then I realized, no way, that's not going to happen. I'm just going to learn the syntax again. That just reinforces the energy that I get from writing books.
I'd like to offer that writing and coding are narratives, narratives. Really good code have narratives and books have narratives, or good books have narratives. And to me, you're a storyteller too. So that's one of the things I'm hearing you say that I think is true.
Very well reflected. Totally.
Well reflected.
I identify with that.
Yeah. Very good at narration. So now you have a new book, Startup Community Way. And say a bit about why you wrote that. It's not really a sequel to Startup Communities. It's newer information, perhaps a little more global in reach, more interactivity and collaboration. What caused you to write that?
So about 3 years ago, I had started to develop a relationship with a friend that's my co-author, Ian Hathaway. And he made a comment to me and basically a proposal. He said, and he was doing a lot of stuff around startup communities and entrepreneurial ecosystems and ecosystem building as part of his work. And he said, I think you need a sequel. You need another book to extend startup communities, because it's 5 years later and lots of people are saying, hey, we've been doing stuff for 5 years, now what? And what should we do? And many of the things that people are saying are actually counterproductive, or they're asking questions or they're making assertions that don't really have anything to tie to. They're just defaulting to normal human behaviors after you've been doing something for a while, versus having a framework. Great, the Boulder Thesis is really helpful for getting me going in this frame of reference, but 5 years later, I need some more. And so his proposal was, hey, I'd love to write a book like that with you. And Ian has a history as an economist. He has a long sort of interest in entrepreneurship. He's been involved as an entrepreneur, but also as an intellectual thinker around it. He spent some time with the Brookings Institute, a couple of other organizations, including one that I helped start called Center for American Entrepreneurship. I was one of the early funders of that. That's a policy-based organization around entrepreneurship. we kind of bounced it back and forth for a little while. I'm like, yep, good, I'm in. You're right. This is a good thing to play with. So we spent about a year writing a bunch of stuff. And after a year, we looked at each other and said, this sucks. Like, yeah, we've written 30,000 words, but it sucks. Like, this is not a thing. And we hit a low point, a real low point. And one day he reached out, we ended up talking, and he said, I've come up with the framing for the book. I know what a startup community is now, and I have a frame of reference for it. I said, tell me more. He said, a startup community is a complex adaptive system.
Mhm.
And we've shortened the phrase to just complex systems because complex adaptive system is too ponderous. A complex adaptive system is just a subtype of complex system. I had been fascinated with complexity theory going back to the early 90s. I read one of the very early books about Brian Arthur and the theory of increasing returns, which is kind of basically just a positive feedback loop. Because of my MIT background, I knew about game of life and sort of emergent behavior and sort of thinking about things around that. I was, one of my regrets in life is I didn't get involved in the Santa Fe Institute when I probably could have and had time and energy for getting involved in it, which was really the origin point of complexity theory in the late 80s. And essentially, after a moment of silence, I'm like, yep, you're right. And we then took everything we knew about startup communities and built it on a framework of complex systems. And part of doing that and writing that book is not so much explaining to people what complex systems are and what complex is, but you've got to do that too, right? You can't assume that your reader is going to start with that frame of reference. So as we got deeper into writing the book, we realized that more and more of it was helping people understand how to think about complex systems, which of course are everywhere in our lives, not just in startup communities. And we were simply using the idea of startup communities as an example of how complex systems work, and then complexity theory as a way to understand how to evolve and develop and grow your startup community over time. About November of last year, November of 19, we were done. We had the book written, and we had a conversation which was not this sucks, but we were both incredibly dissatisfied with the sequencing of the book. We just didn't like the way the book was ordered. We didn't like how we tried to explain things, and it was just hard to read. It wasn't vibrant. It didn't sort of grab you and hang together the right way. And so we did, what, again, I think most engineers understand this very well. We broke our book into basically 100 components. We used a spreadsheet. So, rows and columns. I think we probably had about 20 columns, and maybe we ended up with about 15 rows. And we put those 100 blocks in boxes, and we reorganized the entire book. And we worked on it for about a week, sort of going back and forth and restructuring it and coming up with, the vertical, the rows were each chapters and the columns were different things that we're trying to weave into the thought process. And in the end, we came up with something we're really happy with. And then we had to do a lot of rewriting, not of the content, but of the connections between the content, which is very meta, because in a complex system, the stuff that's interesting is the connections, not the content. And the things that happen in between the content is what really is the power of then what generates from the complex system. We finished the book in April. And we really finished in February, but we were sort of going back and forth and tuning things. And what we didn't expect was that the book would be coming out in the middle of the collision of a series of complex systems that are unprecedented in our experience, right? The COVID crisis is a complex system. It consists of, initially, I wrote a post at the end of March that I said, the COVID crisis is actually 3 crises: a health crisis, the disease; an economic crisis, which was generated by the disease. We had a very strong economy in absence of COVID; a mental health crisis that's emergent from this. We're not used to being in our houses 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There's enormous amount of pressure on people on all kinds of dimensions, Not just, I have to live in my house, but socioeconomic dimensions endlessly, oppositional behavior dynamics, and then all the normal mental health issues that we exist and deal with as a society. And then, of course, sort of in the midst of all of this incredible pressure that everybody is under, George Floyd gets murdered and a racial equity crisis emerges. None of these four crises are new, right? In the US, the racial equity crisis or racial inequity has been going on, or systemic racism, whatever you want to label it, has been going on for 450 years. We have health crises all the time. I was in college during HIV and AIDS, and it was a terrifying health crisis, especially for a college student. All of these are these complex systems that are continually evolving over a long period of time. The collisions and the second order effects and the subsequent emergent behavior and the phase shifts that happen in society, and these are all words that I'm using that are words around complex systems, are incredibly powerful right in this moment. Many of them are positive, many of them are negative. That's just the essence of the thing. And so we then were able to put that together in the context of this book. And I think our hope for the book, especially in the midst of this crisis, is that people can read it and get a different viewpoint on how to think about the evolution of behavior in a complex system, rather than the historical dynamic and the natural programming of most humans to try to control what's going on or fix what's going on, which almost by definition you can't do in a complex system. That top-down control, that top-down I'm going to solve the problem, it doesn't work. It has to be a bottoms-up emergent phenomena that continually modifies.
So I was really fascinated with the research foundations in the book. I read a pre-release version, and I thought they were all very interesting. And I'm a real fan of understanding research foundations and systems. I think it's super important, and especially as it, applies to certainly some of the crises we find ourselves in now, but also entrepreneurship. And I have a bullet list here, which, forgive me, I have to read, I couldn't memorize all of these, but these are the kinds of things that are talked about in the book that are in some sense typical mistakes, if you will, when you don't have systems point of view. So for example, applying linear systems thinking in a non-linear world, attempting to control a startup community, control, right? I think that's really very interesting. Addressing problems in isolation, focusing on parts of a startup community rather than the interactions between them, which is what we're getting to in your last answer. Believing that a startup community is formulaic or replicable. Yeah, and measuring the wrong things. And it reminds me a lot of just innovation in general too, because it's also very often messy, right? People sometimes don't like mess. So why don't you talk a minute about some of these common mistakes, since we're now sort of a little deeper into complexity theory, and maybe riff on a couple of them.
Well, I'll start with the last one, because it's one that I think in business theory and also in entrepreneurship, we've done ourselves a real disservice with the evolution of a classic Peter Drucker line, or classic Peter Drucker construct, which is a good construct, but it is only good when applied correctly. And the incorrect dynamic is that the phrase is, if you don't measure it, you won't manage it. And that, when correctly applied, is really powerful, but when incorrectly applied, can be devastating to the thing you're trying to create. And the place where it can be devastating is when the things you're measuring are the easy things to measure. And in startup communities especially, and more formally entrepreneurial ecosystems, we define the difference in the book. We spent a whole chapter on this because it's worth understanding the difference. But for simplicity's sake, a startup community is a smaller circle. And the center of that smaller circle, a startup community exists to serve and support entrepreneurs. An entrepreneurial ecosystem is sort of an expansion of that, which has different sets of goals depending on who you are in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. At the core of it still is supporting entrepreneurs, but that's one of the distinctions between the two that's foundational. So let's go to the easy measures, right? Well, if you're building out a startup community and growing a startup community, what are easy measures? Number of companies created, number of employees, amount of funding, things like that, right? And you end up in this place, especially if you're trying to justify investment in, energy in the startup community, trying to measure that and show year-over-year growth. So if you work for a nonprofit, or you work for the government that's somehow involved, local government involved in the startup community, those are likely things that your boss is telling you have to measure to show progress. And so then all of a sudden behavior orients around increasing those measures. But those measures are actually not the interesting things to measure. They're worth measuring, but they're not the drivers. So then if you manage what you're doing based on those measures, you will inhibit massive things happening in the context of the growth and development and evolution of this complex system. And by the way, when those numbers don't increase at whatever ratio you think they should be increasing year over year, you might pull back investment in what you're doing in that startup community, and you create a negative feedback loop, which actually inhibits it, which is a reaction to something that you did, to something that you shouldn't have been measuring that way over that time period in the first place. There are a lot of things that are worth measuring and how you measure them in different approaches, but it's hard. And interestingly, the research literature that we did, we broke this up very nicely. Ian read all the hard stuff, and I read all the easy stuff. He went very, very deep on really understanding all the models, because pretty quickly, I had this as an assertion that while there are lots of frameworks around this that people had developed between the first book that I wrote in 2012 and today, our sense was the vast majority of the things that people had written in the academic literature were impossible for normal people to respond to and process. So we tried to pull out the things that were interesting and all that. And over and over and over again, we would run into conclusions that people drew that validated or refuted hypotheses, but that were built on data that was totally irrelevant to the dynamics of how the system was working. So that would be one. I'll pick up on prompt me with one other. I'll do another one, Lucy, that's your choice.
Oh, yay. Gosh, you put me on the spot.
Pick randomly.
I am. Addressing problems in isolation.
So this is a reflection to some degree also of the notion of inclusivity from the Boulder Thesis. Remember the point, the principle 3 is you have to be inclusive of anyone who wants to engage at any level. In a startup community or in any complex system, the thing that is most powerful is the interaction of the various actors, not the actors themselves, and not the factors that they're actually executing and creating, right? So it's kind of not the people and not the things, but what's happening when the people are interacting with each other around the things. And so if you isolate a set of people and a set of things from each other, so that this group of people is working on this thing, and this group of people is working on this thing, within that cycle, yeah, some stuff happens, but you lose so much of the richness when you can not merge them together and now have one bigger group of people working on one bigger set of things, but when this group of people and this group of people have interaction effects. And the interaction effects could be very simple. It could be around one specific thing that they're both interested in where there's overlap, or it could be around a couple of people that are interested in something else, where they're now interacting with each other around something else, but reflecting back on those other pieces. And if you come back to this notion of a network that I described earlier, the mismeasurement in a network, and we've been programmed this way from Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn, and probably now with whatever the cool kids today use, of which I unfortunately know what they are since I'm a venture capitalist. But now I'm too old, right? Like, am I ever really going to engage with TikTok in an authentic way? Probably not. The thing that happens though is that we've been programmed to think the number of people who follow us, or the number of people who we follow, or the number of things that we like is important. And so we try to accumulate more. That's wrong. What's interesting in a network is not how many connections you have to your node in that network. It's also, by the way, not the value of the information you put across your connections, it's both. And so somebody who has an enormous number of connections in a network, but provides almost no value across those connections is not very valuable to the network. The person that has 3 connections and provides immense value over those 3 connections is not very valuable to the network. It's actually the product of the number of connections you have times the value of the information that flows across those connections, both directions, by the way, not just outbound, but also inbound. The second thing I said is incredibly hard to measure. Right? It's really easy to measure the number of connections you have. It's really hard to measure the value of that information. And by the way, in a lot of cases, the value of that information is very subjective. So the more you can get that connection happening, the more positive feedback loop occurs, the more power and value there is in the network, which again is a startup community. And this idea of isolating pieces is counterproductive to that. So that's why we try to frame it that way.
That's a perfect real world example too, using social media, to explain a lot of that, I think is super interesting. The other thing in the book which spoke to me were the pullouts on, I think, virtues and values, I believe is so different pullout boxes for people who are listening, talking about different topics. And they'll be very important to read. I really got a lot out of them, and a couple of them in particular, since we were just talking about networks, why don't you talk first about one of the virtues and values that you call give first? Like how, because I know that speaks to you and Amy personally, and it's related to the network as well. So why don't you talk a little bit about that particular value?
So let me describe where give first came from, and I like to remind everybody that it's now hashtag give first. So there's an actual hashtag in front of it, but there's a story behind that. So in startup communities in 2012, I wrote a very small section. I didn't think very hard about it. I wrote a very small section, maybe 2 or 3 paragraphs, buried in one of the chapters, a subtitle, Give Before You Get. And I described it as a key part of how startup communities get momentum, or the flywheel, or whatever language you want to have get going. And the idea of give before you get is that you put energy into a system non-transactionally. You don't define in advance what you're going to get, who you're going to get it from, how much of whatever it is you're going to get, in what consideration, in what time frame. You're just willing to put energy into the system. It's not altruism. You do expect to get something back. You're just not defining it transactionally. That was 2012. I wrote this section. That became embedded within the philosophy of Techstars. And the idea of how we were at Techstars, as we were starting to grow around the US and then internationally into other startup communities and other places in the world, trying to help the local startup communities that we were now dealing with start to build a value system around the idea of mentorship and the power of mentorship and the notion of startup community and how to build on that startup community. And someone at Techstars at some point very wisely decided that give before you get is not a particularly good hashtag in Twitter, especially when Twitter was still limiting, like it counted the number of letters in the hashtag against your 140 characters in a way that really inhibited long hashtags. And somebody rebranded it Give First. And that became the mantra of Techstars. And the idea that give first is a foundational behavioral pattern of participants in a startup community. It turns out to be my own and Amy's philosophy of life. It's the way that we engage with people and things and stuff, is we're willing to engage regularly in things without defining upfront what we're going to get out of it. And, you know, Lucy, my experience with you is probably a good example of that, right? When we had our first meeting to talk about NCWIT, and you know, you gave me your description of why you wanted to get me involved, and I said you had me at the word innovation. I didn't know in that moment what I was going to get out of NCWIT and the experience with NCWIT. Yes, you know, your initial hypothesis was compelling, and you were compelling in terms of recruiting me, and you had a lot of credibility with Terry Gold, who I think was the person that introduced us. So like all of those things were very positive. When I reflect on the last 15 years, I mean, I've gotten so much more out of my experience with NCWIT than I've given to it from my measurement. From your measurement, I'll leave it to you to decide whether you feel like you've gotten a lot out of my involvement in NCWIT over the last 15 years or not. But the decision to invest energy in it and time and resources, it was easy to decide to do that. And my worst case was that I put time and energy and resources into something that the payoff wasn't that big. Part of the value in a startup community, or frankly in any complex system, is if you're always taking that approach, you're always willing to engage before you know what's going to happen. Rather than saying, you know what, I'm happy. I'm totally happy to be involved in NCWIT. This is what I need to have. This is what you need to do for me before I'll say yes. I mean, Daniel and I had this experience at Microsoft where I remember when Daniel invited me to be on an advisory board for him. I didn't say, okay, I'm happy to do that if you do A, B, C, D, E for me. Like, okay, cool, whatever, we'll see where it goes. And, you know, I don't know how many years later, but 10 or 15 years later, like the richness of the things that I've gotten out of that experience, not just through the experience with Microsoft, but also my personal relationship with Daniel, other things I've learned from him, my ability to engage and support other things like the Computer History Museum. It just goes on and on and on. And so I think it's such a powerful way to approach innovation and entrepreneurship. By the way, I do have people who cynically say to me things like, great, why don't you give me $5 million bucks? And if I'm successful, I'll just send you back something in the future. And I say, look, you know, that's taking the principle too far, right? If I'm going to invest in you, like, let's define that as an investment. So there's lots of places where that principle doesn't carry all the way out. And that's part of the nice thing about it, which is you can lead with that, but then understand in situations where other approaches apply.
There's I can't say this word, it's reciprocal, right? I mean, when you, reciprocity, that's it. Okay. We have gotten a tremendous amount out of you being involved with NCWIT. And I remember the first blog you wrote about it, I think my nephew in Japan wrote me and said, do you know Brad Feld? He just wrote about you. I'm like, oh. And it was a blog called Why the NCWIT Board Chair is a Man. Do you remember that?
I do remember that.
It's still, people should go dig that up. It was great. And it was 2005, I think.
Yeah, it was very early. Yeah.
And today, well ahead of your time, around majority group allies and how do we be, you know, successful allies for groups that are underrepresented in whatever environments we're in, right? In any place we are. And so, yeah, Give First is really such a great thing. And it isn't, you know, it's not a selfish act, but it's also not an altruistic act. It's actually an adventure. You know?
It is totally an adventure. And look, anybody that's listening that is an entrepreneur or involved in entrepreneurship knows that any individual company is an endless series of small experiments, most of which fail. And the ones that work, you do more of it. And when you fail at an experiment, you learn from it and you change your hypothesis and you run another experiment. I believe that is the essence of a life, is that it's an endless series of small experiments where you have a hypothesis or an idea, you try some stuff around it. If it doesn't work, you learn from it and then evolve and modify and change some things, which could include saying, you know what, I don't want to do this anymore. I am not every 3 years going to learn a new programming language. I have done that 5 times. I have learned what I'm going to learn from that, and I realize that I'm not learning anything more from that. However, I figured something else out from running that experiment multiple times that's really something that's powerful for me, and I'm going to then take advantage of that. And it's just this very a very useful, at least from my frame of reference, philosophy, which in so many ways is counter to the traditional approach in non-entrepreneurial context, right? You got to work your way up the ladder. You can't make mistakes. You have to do what the organization tells you to do. You have to follow their norms. There's really only two ways, my view, there's only two ways to get promoted in a big organization. It's either to completely subscribe to the organization's norms and figure out how to do what you need to do in the context of those norms to get a promotion, or you need to completely undermine your boss so your boss gets fired and there's a hole there and then you get promoted into that hole. And that's completely different than the way things work with entrepreneurship.
Or you can be disobedient at potatoes, etc.
And get fired, like that, pretty clear.
Well, so speaking of adventures, let's just turn to sort of one of the events of the day. This is a recent adventure you went on, another example of Give First, when you and are still volunteering your time and energy around the state of Colorado's COVID response. And we want to give us a sense of how you got involved with that. I think it's a perfect example of Give First, among other things. And how are you thinking now about this sort of complex system, these systems that are coming together now? What advice might you have for entrepreneurs too?
So the last day the first day I was sheltered in place was March 11th. So the last day I left my house was March 10th. I have only left my house 3 times since then. Twice were to go to the doctors for Amy for a small procedure, and once was to go to the doctors for a procedure for me. So I've also sort of in the context of COVID, decided that I'm going to be shelter in place for at least through the end of 2020. So I've concluded that, maybe I'll come out in 2021, but for now, I'm going to experience it here. The week of March 11th, I think it was March 13th, a group of our, maybe it's March 12th, a group of us led by a guy named Brian Leach, who runs a company called Ibotta, got together and had a conference call to a group of Denver, Boulder entrepreneurs and business leaders. And we had a conference call to talk about what we were going to do in the context of our work. It was about 75 people. And it was really enlightening as everybody was starting to kind of try to get their mind around, should we work from home? Should we, is shelter in place coming? So that was when I engaged at the beginning of this. A couple of days later, our governor, Jared Polis, who's a longtime friend, he's a co-founder of Techstars. He's one of the first people I met when I moved to Boulder. He's been a multi-time, very successful entrepreneur. Had a company called BlueMountainArts.com that he sold to Excite at the peak of the internet bubble. Had another company called Provide Commerce that went public, and then he sold to Liberty Media. And is just a amazing person. He was our congressman. He's always been interested in politics. Was our congressman for 10 years, and then became our governor 2 years ago. And he reached out to me, I guess a year and a half ago. He reached out to me and said, "Brad, I've got great machinery around doing stuff in the state of Colorado, but I don't have any entrepreneurs around me. I don't have any entrepreneurial thinking. And this COVID thing is moving fast." And I said, yes. And I need some entrepreneurs on my team to help figure out creative things in the midst of this thing that's happening. And by the way, this was at the very beginning. So we had no idea collectively of where it was going to go or how bad it was going to get and what the dynamics would be. So I reached out to a couple of colleagues. One of them was Matt Blumberg. Matt was CEO for many years of a company called Return Path, which had a very large office in Colorado. He lives in New York, but he had a large Colorado office. And he was on the bench. He started a new company subsequently called Bolster, but he didn't have a full-time job. And I said, "Hey, Matt, I need somebody like you. We need somebody like you in Colorado. Jared wants somebody like you to come out here." And Matt knew Jared a little bit. Don't really know what it means. Don't know how long the tour of duty is, but probably, you know, a month at least. And we just need to like get some thinking against this. And Matt thought about it for 24 hours and said, you know, I care a lot about Colorado, done. So he came out, and you know, he wrote a series of blog posts about it that are fascinating, which sort of day by day his experience. Day one, he talked to me at the end of the day and said, I don't know if I can be helpful. I have no idea what to do. Day two, he says, I'm starting to get a perspective on what I might be able to do that's helpful. And day three, he says, I've got this figured out. Will you be chair of the private sector side of this public sector thing that we're going to create that's cross-functional within government in the state of Colorado? And I said, yes, you know, of course I will. So we ended up creating a thing that was a private sector team called Innovation Response Volunteers. There was a private sector side of the Innovation Response team, which was a completely new structural thing within Colorado state government. Matt got it going, and then we recruited a woman named Sarah Thunberg, who had spent her whole life in emergency management and was an entrepreneur. And she took over from Matt about week 2 or week 3. Matt went back to New York, and Sarah scaled this up. I ended up then building essentially a startup of about 150 people that were involved in the innovation emergency response side of things at the beginning of the COVID crisis, which included a very large volunteer software team led by Tim Miller, a human services team, which Lucy, you led, of course, and a PPE procurement team, which was led by a guy named Noel Ginsberg. And essentially, we accomplished some things, and we had lots of things that we didn't make much progress on. But we were able to deal with a bunch of stuff that state government couldn't literally deal with in the fog of war of just dealing with this immediate response to COVID. And it was an unbelievably fascinating experience that I think mostly, with the exception of a bunch of software that we're continuing to work on that we've deployed now across the state for tracking, most of that activity has become incorporated now into the state government. The other side of it is, at the same time, I got involved and asked to head up a committee as part of a task force that was ponderously named the Governor's Economic Stabilization and Growth Council. I have to think about it every time I say it. And I was responsible for business across Colorado that had 500 people or less, which of course included most of the entrepreneurial, not all, but most of the entrepreneurial companies, but also local business, women minority-led business, nonprofits. We have a very large rural business dynamic in Colorado because of the geography of the state. These two things were happening at the same time. So Lucy remembers sort of my life during this period of time where I essentially had a full-time job at Foundry dealing with all of our portfolio companies too, and what ended up becoming a full-time job dealing with spinning up these two organizations. I realized pretty quickly that the economic piece that I was on was just going to be making recommendations. And I felt like there was something more valuable across the state of Colorado for companies that had 500 people or less. And very early on, co-founded what has become a nonprofit called Energize Colorado. It's led by Wendy Lee, another person Lucy knows well, who's a successful entrepreneur in town. And had also had a lot of experience because she spent 4 years in Cincinnati running a public-private partnership that rejuvenated a lot of the entrepreneurial activity in Cincinnati. And she runs that organization. That's now about 250 volunteers with the idea of Coloradans helping Coloradans in the private sector through this crisis and beyond as we grow our economy again for companies and people in companies that are 500 people or less. So I use those examples. Like, I had no idea on March 11th what I was going to do around the COVID crisis. I had no idea on March 14th, which was probably the day I talked to Jared, or maybe the day after I talked to Jared. Matt had no idea when he got on the plane to come out here, other than the fact that New York was completely melting down, and he probably figured even though his family was safe, it might be more fun to be in Colorado for a couple of weeks. We really had no idea when we first had the conversation, I think March 23rd, about Energize Colorado, what that would turn into. And so it was just a bunch of entrepreneurial efforts in the midst of chaos, that's the collision of a bunch of complex systems. And if you look at the evolution of both the innovation response team and the evolution of Energize Colorado, the things that we hypothesized would be interesting that didn't work, we stopped doing. The things that did work and had impact, we did more of. And we were very flexible about our level of commitment and long-term engagement around it, because we recognized that we were in service of the state of Colorado. That's what we were doing, not something else. We weren't appealing to our egos or trying to control something or anything like that. We were literally in service to the state. And it was very, in retrospect, very powerful to learn a lot about what is easy and what is hard when you're in the private sector trying to work with state government, especially in the midst of a crisis.
Okay, well, thank you for that. We have 15 more minutes and we have some questions from the listeners. And let's just go ahead and stay in the area of current events. There are several questions that are clustered around racial equity, social justice. How are you thinking about these? I know you're doing a lot of thinking about them, informing yourself, reading, etc. What should we do in the entrepreneurial spaces around racial equity, for example? How do we do more than write a statement, tuck it away? How do we do what has to be done to eradicate racism and racial injustice, and how do we apply that to being entrepreneurs?
So I'll personalize it rather than make a broad statement that answers the question, what should people do? Because I don't know how to make the broad statement. I don't feel like that's my place, but I can describe how I'm thinking about it, and if that's useful to people, please build on it. The weekend after George Floyd was murdered, I was very unhappy and had a very weekend. I think as I sort of had to process it, but by Sunday I landed on a model that I had used for myself 15 years earlier, which was how I engaged with eliminating gender inequity in tech. And that obviously was a role and a relationship with you from the very beginning. And what I did was I got involved in service of you. I didn't realize that I was becoming a male advocate or a male ally. I don't think that language certainly was not, I wasn't aware of that language at the time. But I learned very quickly that pretty much everything I thought about gender equity or gender inequity in tech was wrong. All the anecdotes that men, and mostly, by the way, white men, asserted or suggested about what to do about it was wrong. Most of the things that were said by men, at the best, were probably neutral and were often harmful or hurtful. And that many of the things that were going on were deeply structural. And instead of and I sort of learned that within the first 3 to 6 months of spending time with you and spending time around the organization. And so what I decided to do was invert my natural frame of reference, which is to be a problem solver and suggest solutions and then try to execute the solutions, to understand that I hadn't had the lived experience that you, Lucy, had had, and that many of the women that I was now talking to as a result of my involvement with NCWIT had had as women in technology and women in computer science. And so I oriented myself to listen, learn, and engage and support the women in the things they were doing to affect change. And, my whole life works off of a long-term view. I mean, I'm a venture investor. We have to have a long-term view to be a venture investor because most things take a long time to turn into a success. I knew that I would have a long experience there with you of learning. So I applied the same to racial equity or racial inequity. And again, whether you want to label it systemic racism, racial equity, racial inequity, my framing for it was equivalent. Interestingly, Amy and I have been involved in philanthropically through our foundation, which is the Anchor Point Foundation. We've been supporting social justice causes for 20 years. So we view ourselves as supporters of social justice causes. But when I reflected on my engagement with the leaders of those organizations and the people in those organizations in an effort to eliminate racism, I was nowhere on that. I wasn't doing anything on that dimension other than, feeling like I was supporting social justice causes. So I took the same approach I took with NCWIT. I made a list of the people in tech, and I focused on entrepreneurship and technology because that's the domain that I feel like I can really get engaged in and hopefully over a long period of time influence in a constructive way. I made a list of the Black VCs and founders who I felt like I had a relationship with. And unfortunately, that was a very short list. I mean, I knew more, but that I actually had a relationship with, that I viewed as a primary link on my network. And I called each of them, and I had one simple question. The simple question was not, what should I do? Or how should I think about this? Or anything like that, because my view was, and I learned this from Lucy, that just puts the pressure and the burden on the underrepresented person. And it's not their burden, it's my burden. It's not theirs to tell me what to do. That's actually not constructive at all. I did the opposite of that, which is I said, what are two things you are currently involved in that I can support you with the three things I have to support you with, which are time, money, and influence. And I only want to be involved in things you are already doing that you believe my support will be helpful for. In whatever way that means. And interestingly, from that, I mean, some of those things were philanthropic activities. A few of them were brand new things that people wanted to start. Several of them were organizations that already existed that multiple people were not part of, but were doing things with. And some of them were very specific actions I could take as an investor from a commercial perspective for the things that they, as an investor, in the course of that, I've gotten to know now another 15 people or so, many of the people who are leading these organizations, as well as some other introductions. And I'm very focused on doing two things. One is basically asking and answering the same question, or having them answer the same question, what can I do to support you with those resources? But then interconnecting the networks, giving them access to my network, and me becoming part of their network. Not just having access to their networks and not just having access to my networks, but actually starting to engage across those networks in a meaningful way. It's very easy to do. It's something I do all day long anyway as a VC across many things. And by changing that frame of reference to proactively be inclusive on this dimension has been powerful. The last, I'll just end with, remember I love to read. And I learned by reading. I got book recommendations. I found some online book recommendations. Of course, there's been plenty of things written about. Here are the 10 books you should read on systematic racism or racial inequity in the United States. I refer to it as my infinite pile of books. I bought these in hardcover rather than Kindle because it's more tangible. And I'm reading one book a week on this topic. I've read 3 so far. I write about them on my blog. I'm pretty sure I know which book I'm going to read this upcoming weekend. It's a book about Tulsa and what happened in Tulsa. That I will leave it at that, because if you don't know what happened in Tulsa and you don't know what I'm referring to, I encourage exploration of it. I've learned a tiny bit about it, and I found a book that is the recommended history of what happened in a moment of time that I'm almost afraid to really dig into because of how horrific what I have heard, what I have seen, and what I have currently been exposed to is, in terms of the notion of systemic and structural racism in our country. But like each week, I'll kind of work my way through that as part of my own quiet reflection and exploration, rather than crunching it into a short period of time, making that be a long arc. So that's what I'm doing. Pick and choose from that what's useful to you.
And I think it's very important, you know, at NCWIT, we do a lot of work at the intersection of race and ethnicity and gender identity and age and socioeconomic status. And that self-reflection is so important. And for people who are listening, we also have all of our resources are free on our site. And so you'll find some interesting things there too, if you want to dig in a bit to what systemic change is and how we can all be more, more strategic about how we do this. So we don't lose this moment in time. You know, we build on it and we really leverage it. Well, our time has come to an end, but we have one more thing to do. So this is a tradition of the Computer History Museum. It's called the One Word Initiative. Brad, you were asked to write down one word of advice to a young person starting out in their career, or it could be an old person starting out in their entrepreneurial career. Can you share your one word of advice and then the story behind it?
So this is my one word.
Okay, that's a good word.
And the reason I came up with this word, some of it is my message to my younger self. As a young entrepreneur, I didn't allow any time and space in my world for me. And I didn't really understand, I felt indestructible, and I didn't really understand the notion of taking care of myself physically and physiologically, and how that would impact how I went through my day-to-day life, and how I impacted everybody around me, and how that impacted not just the work that I was doing, but the life that I was living. And as a result, as I've been very public about my struggles with anxiety and depression throughout my adult life, I've learned a lot about it and a lot about myself, and I've modified a lot of my behaviors over the years. One of the things that I found to be most powerful, moments where one's own flight or fight reaction takes place, whether it's anxiety, whether it's stress, whether it's a crisis, whether it's a battle, whether it's a disaster, whether it's a failure. In some ways, just taking a breath in that moment, it doesn't make anything go away. You still have to deal with the stuff, but it changes your orientation towards that. And the breath can be short. It can be 3 seconds, or it can be long. It can be the week that I take once a quarter off the grid, no phone, no email. And I spend that week with the person who I was meant to be on this planet with, which is Amy Batchelor. And the two of us just spend a week together. That's a breathe. It could be the time that I sit each morning and meditate in a structured way. It could be the time that I go for a run. I love to run. And just allowing myself in those moments to reset so much of that physiological dynamic, knowing that much of life is hard. Much of life is a crisis. A friend of mine from many years ago, whose son died at about age 20 of cancer, said the cliche, which many people may know, is that life is a fatal disease. My chemistry friends out there will say life is a process of continuous oxidation. And this notion of just breathing and giving yourself a moment to reset on a regular basis is something I wish my 20-year-old self had known.
It's great advice. And so thank you for sharing that. And can you remind people again when Startup Community Way is coming out? I believe it's the end of this month. Is that correct?
Yep. So Startup Community Way comes out July 28th. There's a website, startupcommunityway.com, that has links to things. Of course, you can buy it on all your favorite online booksellers. The pre-order campaign is going on now. And I would be a bad author if I didn't shill for my pre-order campaign. So if you're interested in what we've talked about today and you're interested in the book, I encourage you to pre-order a copy of it. And if you haven't read Startup Communities, I have a second edition of it coming out also on July 28th. That's freshened up and updated and has a few new chapters and fixed a few things that I got wrong with the first edition.
Well, great. Congratulations to you and Ian on the new book.
Thanks.
And I'll hand it back over to Daniel.
Lucy, thank you for doing this.
Oh, my pleasure, always.
Awesome. That was great.
Yes, thank you both very, very much. You put in context so many things that are fundamental to our institution's goals in the future. And as we've begun with our new mission, it's about humanity forward. It's about people first. And I think your reflections on your past and diving into computer systems and learning about the systems, and your present, which is all network-based and system-based, really does highlight the necessity that people and the interactions matter most and what we need. I can't thank you both enough for such an engaging and relevant conversation for our goals as an institution. And we wish you well in the future. And we wish your book sales to be high. So thank you all, and thanks all of our guests for coming. It's been a great program. We'll see you all soon. Thanks.